11 feet, 12 feet tall. And they sit in front of all the homes, so it's very hard to see the front, the actual front of almost any of these homes.
You know, it's extremely private by Palm Beach standards.
So if you wanted to be to yourself, that was like the perfect place.
Any car that comes down the street and somebody doesn't pull in a driveway or get out and go into the house would be questionable.
So police had to get creative in order to watch Epstein's home. They even asked neighbors if they could use their homes to watch Epstein's house.
They were doing old-fashioned stakeouts in unmarked cars down the street, watching who's coming and going, and sometimes sitting there in the middle of the night.
But the other challenge in monitoring Epstein was Epstein himself. With several homes around the world and a private jet, he was hard to watch on a consistent basis.
He always had a driver. We certainly surveilled his aircraft. We certainly followed his aircraft movements.
Detectives even coordinated with the town so they could pull Epstein's trash and look for evidence.
It's a meticulous and not fun thing to do. We would get a big table and spread everything out and look for evidence.
Epstein's trash would provide investigators with evidence. Police reports obtained by ABC News say they recovered sex toys that were similar to the ones that victims had described from inside Jeffrey Epstein's home. There were message pads that matched the names of some of the girls police had interviewed, along with the time and date they were expected to be at his home. Police also got a window into Epstein's world. There were calls from magician David Copperfield, Victoria's Secret owner and billionaire Les Wexner, real estate and publishing giant Mort Zuckerman, even Her Royal Highness Sarah, the Duchess of York, and others. Ryder knew that time was not on their side. As police began identifying more victims, he knew it was more than likely that Epstein would find out he was on their radar.
A couple of weeks after the first victim, by that time, we had already contacted several other victims. So we knew that there was a likelihood that one of them could call Epstein and let him know that we were basically on to him.
And Ryder was right. As the investigation progressed, Ryder, Detective Recarey, and other investigators started noticing some odd things.
We found private investigators shooting video of the vehicle lot at the police station and police officers and detectives coming and going.
It didn't take long for them to realize that the target of their investigation had no intention of just letting their work run its course. Epstein had learned he was under investigation, and it appears he decided to do some investigating as well.
I would see a familiar car or a familiar type of rental car parked down the street, and when I would, or following me.
Ryder says he received a tip that Epstein had his own investigators snooping around to find out where the police probe was headed.
I was shocked that there would be 24 hours surveillance on detectives in a case, and on me for a sitting police chief. That's pretty unusual. But we would see it. Joe Recarey, who was the lead detective, would joke sometimes. He would wave to them. I would just totally ignore them.
But it wasn't just surveillance. Ryder says they even noticed someone had gone through the trash at the police station and at his home. And while he never caught anyone red-handed, Ryder believes it was people working for Epstein. And Ryder and his detectives would also hear of incidents involving PIs and some of the girls that they'd been speaking to.
One victim's father felt he was forced off the road in a car by a private investigator. And we had one instance that a victim called us and said that somebody was posing as a police officer and trying to get them to talk. And they said they were at the Palm Beach Police Department. Could you confirm whether or not they were your officers? And they weren't.
At one point, Detective Recarey reviewed phone records to find that a private investigator working for Epstein had called several girls, either just after they were interviewed by police or just before. Some of the victims Detective Recarey interviewed also told him about being contacted by people working for Epstein.
Have you been recently contacted by anybody working for Jeff?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So what kind of questions was he asking? Was the police involved?
Yeah, if
how the police got involved. I said, I don't know. What kind of questions they were asking, I said, I don't know because I hadn't been questioned yet.
Despite the aggressive approach by Epstein, Reiter and his team felt confident in their case. But it would take the state attorney, Barry Krischer, to greenlight any charges.
So the relationship between a police department and the prosecutor is a very important one. I had a great relationship with him. I was the speaker at his last swearing-in ceremony and knew him very well. He was a very effective state attorney.
He was an elected official. He was there for more than 20 years.
State Attorney Barry Krischer was very highly regarded. He was known as a tough prosecutor. You know, if you're going to do the crime, you're going to do the time.
In Florida, it's really the top law enforcement in the county. It's above the sheriff because these guys decide what gets to trial and what doesn't, who gets charged and who doesn't.
Michael Reiter had a number of conversations with Krischer as the investigation went on, keeping him in the loop on how things were progressing. He says early on, the conversations were positive.
Well, after the first time I spoke with the state attorney about the case, he said this will be an easy case and we'll put him away for the rest of his life.
But he says as time went on, things began to change.
The first indicator that something had changed was that the tone of the assistant state attorneys that we had contacted about the case was less cooperative.
Despite this, his detectives continued, and after nearly a year of identifying victims and collecting evidence, police were ready to give Krischer's office the case.
That part of the story was very unusual because the Palm Beach police did a thorough investigation.
They spoke to countless witnesses.
They did trash pulls.
They staked out the place, see who is in and who is out. They had everything documented. They had videos. They had photos.
It was an 11-month investigation. It was intense.
They had everything they needed to paint this guy as a 20-year jailbird.
In a May 2006 affidavit, Palm Beach police recommended multiple felonies against Epstein. 4 counts of unlawful sexual activity with a minor and 1 count of lewd and lascivious molestation. This is ABC's Sunny Hostin, a former federal prosecutor who specialized in child sex crimes.
The charges in and of themselves aren't rape charges, but they are significant charges because sometimes you choose to bring forth the case that is the strongest that you can prove and that will result in a lengthy prison sentence so that you take an offender who very well may be a repeat offender, a serial predator, off the street for an extended period of time.
But Reiter says that Krischer was pushing back and claims that Krischer's attitude toward the case had changed dramatically.
We had presented we thought was a fairly good case on some of the first victims, and that it was not getting the traction that it deserved in his office, that they seemed to be disinterested in the case.
You know, they wouldn't return his call. They wouldn't talk to him sometimes. They put him out to pasture.
Reiter thinks that's because Epstein's lawyers had been working to sow seeds of doubt about the victims. At one point during the investigation, the state attorney's office and the Palm Beach Police Department received a hand-delivered package from Epstein's lawyers. Inside were scans of MySpace profiles of some of the victims, along with letters from the attorneys challenging their credibility.
Epstein's lawyers became very aggressive with the victims, digging up their alcohol use, their drug use. They had pictures of their MySpace pages. Epstein's attorneys brought that to the state attorney and said, look, hey, these girls are doing bad things. These are bad girls. You're not going to be able to prove your case because, we have all this evidence that they're doing bad things.
Those close to the investigation argue that it was a clear case of victim shaming, as the letters point to descriptions of shoplifting, underage drinking, smoking, and having sex. In addition, records show that Epstein's attorneys told police and prosecutors that Epstein simply had a passion for massages and a, quote, unequivocal reputation for being truthful. The approach, Reiter says, appeared to be working.
We felt as though we were speaking to a defense attorney instead of a prosecutor. He was advocating the suspect's position that these really weren't all that serious of circumstances. The victims were untruthful. They wouldn't make good witnesses at trial. There's lots of reasons why this case shouldn't be prosecuted. It was unbelievable then, and it's more unbelievable now.
Ryder became so bothered by the way Krischer's office was handling the case that he even wrote a letter to Krischer urging him to recuse himself.
He saw it totally differently than virtually everybody else from the law enforcement side that was involved in it. When that happens, there's a mechanism in the law to disqualify yourself from the case if you're the prosecutor, and I asked him to do that.
But Ryder says he never received a response to that letter and says he couldn't convince Krischer to move forward with the charges.
I called him several times after his office refused our applications for arrest warrants, and all of my calls and messages were unanswered.
Instead, Krischer takes an unexpected step. He decided to present Epstein's case to a grand jury. It was an unusual move, especially in Florida.
Barry Krischer decided to bring the evidence to a grand jury, which is hardly ever done, very unusual.
With the amount of evidence in a case like this type of robust investigation, I really can't make sense of it.
You can charge directly without a grand jury. That is your prerogative as a state attorney. Professionally, once something like this happens, the state attorney's office should go back to the chief of police and say, okay, well, we got an indictment and this is what it is. Apparently they failed to do that, and Mike Ryder reads about it in the press.
The Palm Beach Post had covered the story that Epstein was indicted and he had turned himself in, I believe it was Sunday night, at the Palm Beach County Jail. I was stunned. We didn't hear anything after that whatsoever. The fact that Epstein was allowed to turn himself into the jail instead of us, the Palm Beach Police Department, we felt was a big error. Because if you're an investigator, you want to have the opportunity to question the suspect. You want to have the opportunity to arrest them, not let them walk into the jail, because sometimes they confess. We didn't have that opportunity. We were not afforded that opportunity.
It was Monday, July 24th, 2006, when Epstein's face appeared in the local newspapers under headlines such as "Mystery Money Man Faces Soliciting Charge." The grand jury had come back with a single felony charge against Epstein: solicitation of prostitution.
There was nothing said about a minor in the charge, which would have been much more serious.
Anyone that investigates, prosecutes child sex crimes knows that this has nothing to do with prostitution. So to present that kind of case in front of a grand jury is abhorrent.
Not only had Epstein escaped any of the tougher charges that Ryder and his detectives had been pursuing for a year, but now all those young girls suddenly weren't portrayed as victims at all. They'd been painted as prostitutes under the law. Epstein had been charged as if he were a typical John, but in reality, he'd been procuring and recruiting young girls so he could sexually abuse them.
Solicitation of prostitution connotes that these young girls were somehow selling sex. And again, you can't have consensual sex with a child. So it's insulting to the victims.
The law labeled them as prostitutes. The laws need to change. And a child can't be willing. A child can't consent to this. This was a smart, wealthy person with a large home in Palm Beach who was able to convince these children to have sexual contact with him. That's his fault. That's not their fault.
It's such a deep hurt, to be called those things. And even at a young age, that's not okay that will never be okay to be identified as that and be okay with that.
I've listened to the recording of me talking to the investigators the person that I heard in that